It was a dark, foggy night on the stretch of highway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. The road was notorious for its solitude, especially at night. There were no towns for miles, no gas stations, no houses, just long stretches of winding road with trees towering over both sides, casting eerie shadows. No one spoke about the road, and no one dared drive it alone at night. Those who did would later claim to hear strange sounds, feel inexplicable coldness, or, worse, see things that weren't there. But few believed these stories. Among the many truck drivers who traveled this infamous route, Jake Anderson had been one of the most experienced. He had been driving trucks for over 15 years, traveling the long stretches of highways that few dared to drive alone. He had heard the rumors of a woman in white who haunted the road, but like most seasoned drivers, he dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories. One night, however, Jake's world would be forever changed. It had been a long day, and Jake had just received his last load of the week, a shipment that had to be delivered to San Francisco by morning. He was tired but determined. The road ahead was empty, and his only company was the dim light from his truck's headlights, which illuminated the winding curves of the road. It was around midnight when the weather started to shift. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air turned thick with fog. Visibility became poor, and Jake's fingers gripped the wheel tighter. As he passed through the usual forested area, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something felt off. The road here was desolate, isolated, no other cars or trucks were in sight, and there was nothing but the sound of his truck's engine and the occasional howling wind. That's when he saw her, a woman, standing motionless at the side of the road. Her white dress glowed eerily in the headlights, almost like a reflection in a mirror. Her long dark hair blew in the wind, but her face was hidden, concealed by a veil of hair. She didn't seem to move, didn't seem to notice the truck speeding toward her. Jake's instincts told him to keep driving, but something inside him made him slow down. He couldn't just leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere at this hour. He pulled the truck to a halt and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" he asked, though his voice felt shaky. The woman didn't respond, nor did she acknowledge him. She simply opened the passenger door and climbed into the truck's cab without saying a word. Her silence was unsettling, but Jake didn't want to be rude. He figured she might just be scared or confused. As soon as she was inside, the air felt colder. Jake shivered and adjusted the heater, but the chill remained. He could feel her presence, her strange energy, but didn't know what to make of it. Her eyes, which Jake now noticed, seemed dark, deep, almost black. They held an unnatural intensity, staring forward, unmoving. Jake tried to strike up a conversation. "Where are you headed?" he asked. No answer. "Are you okay?" Jake asked again, his voice now edged with concern. Still, no answer came. Jake glanced at her a few times, but she didn't acknowledge him. She just stared ahead, her hair still partially covering her face, her expression unreadable. The silence between them felt suffocating. The miles passed in an uncomfortable quiet. The truck, which was usually a smooth ride, began to feel heavier. Jake could feel the truck's load as if something was weighing it down, though he knew there was no reason for it. His engine sputtered a few times, and his heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. He slowed the truck and pulled over to the side of the road. He checked the dashboard, the engine, the tires. Everything seemed fine. Nothing was out of the ordinary. He shook his head, trying to clear the odd sense of dread creeping up his spine. When he climbed back into the cab, he turned to the woman. "You all right?" he asked again, but this time his voice cracked slightly. She was no longer sitting in the same position. Her body had turned, and she was now sitting on the edge of the seat, facing him. But her face was no longer the same. Her eyes had turned completely black. Her hair had become matted with something dark, almost as if it were covered in dirt or blood. The skin on her face looked twisted, stretched in a grotesque way. And then she smiled. A slow, horrific smile that sent a chill through Jake's entire body. Jake's heart raced. What the hell? He gasped. He backed away instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The truck was stopped, and the road was empty. It felt like they were in another world. She didn't say a word, she just stared at him, and then she spoke in a voice that was low, almost like a whisper. But it was laced with a deadly venom. You shouldn't have stopped for me. Jake's stomach dropped. He tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic started to rise in his chest. He slammed the keys in frustration, but nothing happened. The truck was dead. The woman's smile widened. She leaned forward and said, "You're not the first to fall for my tricks, Jake. I was killed on this road many years ago. I died here in a crash, my husband, my children, all gone. This road is mine now. I claim the souls of those who stopped for me. I've been waiting for you." Jake's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. He had heard rumors of a ghostly figure on the highway, stories about a woman who had died in an accident and whose spirit haunted the road, luring people to their doom. But he never believed them, until now. The truck's engine roared to life suddenly, but it wasn't Jake who had started it. He gripped the wheel, his hands clammy. He had to get away. But the truck felt impossibly heavy, as though it was being pulled back by some unseen force. He looked in the rearview mirror, nothing. Just darkness. But when he looked forward again, she was there, in front of him, right in the middle of the road. Her face was twisted, her eyes glowing red now, and her hair billowed in a wild, chaotic wind that seemed to come from nowhere. "You can't escape!" she hissed. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, but it was no use. The truck barely moved. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The woman's laughter filled the cab, loud and terrifying, as she inched closer. Every inch of his being screamed to get out, to run, but there was nowhere to go. In that moment of desperation, Jake did what he could think of. He began to pray, chanting the Lord's Prayer over and over again, his voice growing louder with each word. He closed his eyes tightly, hoping the words would protect him. When he opened his eyes again, the woman was gone. The truck was no longer heavy, and the road was quiet. No laughter, no chill. It was as if nothing had happened. His hands were trembling as he drove the rest of the way to San Francisco, never looking back. When he reached the city, he was physically and mentally exhausted, but his mind raced. The memory of the woman's face, twisted, vengeful, haunted him. He would never be the same again. Days passed and Jake tried to forget the incident, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. He started to lose sleep, growing more and more paranoid. It was like she was watching him, waiting. One evening, a few weeks after the incident, Jake was sitting in a local diner trying to explain to his friends what had happened. They didn't believe him. "It was probably just exhaustion," one of them said. "You've been on the road too long." But Jake knew better. The fear that gripped him was real, and no amount of denial could change that. That night, his fears became reality once again. Jake received another delivery order, the same route, the same stretch of highway. This time, he was determined. He wouldn't stop for anyone, no matter who they were. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. As he drove, the temperature dropped and a fog rolled in. His mind kept racing, his hands tight on the wheel. He passed the forest and that same sense of dread washed over him. Then, there she was. The woman in white? Jake gripped the wheel tighter, but this time he didn't stop. He sped past her, his heart pounding. But then, something happened that made him question his every belief. The truck began to slow, its engine sputtering. He tried to accelerate, but the truck's speed kept decreasing. The woman appeared in the rearview mirror, closer than ever. "You can't escape, Jake," she said, her voice echoing inside the truck. Panic surged in Jake's chest as he realized he couldn't outrun her. He was stuck. There was nowhere to go. But then he remembered the advice of a local spiritualist. He reached for the protective charm she had given him, gripping it tightly in his hand. He closed his eyes and began to chant, the words of the prayer louder and louder. The truck's engine roared back to life, and when he opened his eyes again, the woman was gone. Jake didn't look back this time. He didn't stop until he reached San Francisco. From that night onward, Jake never traveled that highway alone at night. He shared his story with others, warning them about the dangers of the haunted road. Some believed him, others thought it was just a story. But Jake knew the truth. The woman in white was real, and she was always waiting for her next victim. The cursed highway continued to claim souls, and truckers like Jake knew to pass it by with caution, praying for protection, hoping that the ghostly woman would never appear again.